Greetings, APUS history scholars, looking at the review sheet from top to bottom here. Differences between Spanish, French, and Dutch settlement in the New World, reasons for settlement, and relations with the Indians. A few thoughts on this. The Spanish had extensive settlements from what would be Florida and the Southwest and Mexico down to the bottom of South America. And the Spanish plundered the Aztecs and the Incas of their gold and of their silver. But the Spanish came and settled also brought settlers over for good, and these settlers intermarried. So you have a new sort of racial group called the mestizos, part Spanish, part Indian. And this is in distinction with the English, who had very little of this racial mixing. The Spanish set up encomiendas, and encomiendas were sort of plantations that Indians were forced to work on. You have Spanish missions to convert the Indians, to teach them Western ways, to school them, to catechize them, teach them things like farming and skills like perhaps blacksmithing, carpentry, things like that. You have presidios, forts in the especially in the southwest of what would be the United States. And there's that quote that's on the Tom Ritchie video, which I like. It's a good quote. Lead me, walk with me, or get out of the way. And the lead me is going to refer to those groups that were small in numbers, such as the Dutch and the French, who are getting along with the Indians because they need their help in hunting down these beaver pelts. So lead me, show me how to get what we want. We'll work with you. But walk with me is pretty much the Spanish and the Indians. In other words, do what we say, walk our way, become Catholic, become civilized, and from a Spanish perspective. The English, on the other hand, the English are going to be sort of exclusionary, and that comes in part from these Calvinist Puritan settlers who don't have they have this idea that they're the elect, and certainly the Indians are not. Now, the French came in small numbers to Quebec, and the French did explore down the Mississippi River, and they had some settlements in the upper Midwest, but mostly along the Mississippi down to Louisiana, around New Orleans, claimed by Robert La Salle for King Louis, thus the term Louisiana, which you guys should know is not just the state today, but all the land that's drained between the Appalachians and the Rocky Mountains. Location of colonial settlements. Again, the Spanish are primarily in what would be the current U.S. and Florida, and in the Southwest, what would be California, Texas, New Mexico, and what will become Arizona. The English are between Georgia and what would be New Hampshire, and the Dutch are in New York, and the French are again in the interior along the Mississippi and in what we would call Quebec today, French Canada. How did the Indians adapt to their environment? Some thoughts on this, and this is just a real general thumbnail sketch. On the Great Plains, the Indians hunted the bison. The bison, they wore their skins as clothing. They took the skins and wove them, sewed them together for teepees. They used the bones for tools. They used the buffalo dung to cook their food over. So buffalo is an all-purpose animal. And when the Indians came across wild horses that escaped from the Spanish, they learned how to ride these horses to hunt the buffalo very effectively. All through North America, the Indians grew corn. In fact, they grew what are called the Three Sisters. This is corn with beans and squash interspersed in between the corn stalks. And this provided the nutrition that Indians needed to carry a population, especially in areas that had large agricultural plots. In the Southwest, it should be noted that the Indians, with the lack of rain, diverted the water through irrigation to grow their corn, and the Indians in some places in the Southwest lived in pueblos, lived in these cave-like adobe structures. In the woodlands is pretty much the Midwest through the eastern woodlands. This is a sort of large swath of what would be sort of between the Mississippi and the Atlantic in the northern part of current-day United States. You have sort of semi-nomadic culture in the summer. You've got the growing of Three Sisters, particularly corn, but you also have hunting, which during the winter would be more important. The braves would go off and and hunt deer. But if you're on long water, you're hunting, not hunting, you're fishing, you are clamming along the Great Lakes and the rivers. You have dugout canoes or birch bark canoes so that you can get around on large bodies of water. So the Indians are adapting for their own benefit. And the Iroquois, famously in the upper New York area, are developing a political confederation, which militarily was strong. They dominated tribes around them, and they lived in longhouses, sort of these communal dwellings. In the Pacific Northwest, you have dependence on salmon. You have these salmon runs, which today probably 95% of the salmon in the Northwest are gone because of the Army Corps of Engineers has dammed every one of these rivers. But that being said, at the time, salmon was plentiful, and the Indians would dry it, and it had a good protein source for the rest of the year. As far as the Pilgrims and Puritans, how were they different? How were they the same? Why did they come over? Where did they settle? You should know John Winthrop and the City on the Hill and the Old Diluter Act. Some thoughts on all these terms. The Pilgrims, another name for the Separatists. They come over in 1620, and they settle what would be the Plymouth colony, which later is going to be swallowed up by the larger Puritan colony in Massachusetts Bay. So theologically, they believe the same things. They're coming over for religious worship. They'd been persecuted by the Church of England, or the Anglicans, and they were being jailed, they were being fined, they were being whipped, and they wanted freedom to worship as they wanted. It should be noted the Puritans are famous for not allowing religious freedom to others. They believed that for God to bless their commonwealth, to bless their experiment, they needed conformity. They needed laws that everybody would obey. So they came over for religious freedom, but they did persecute Quakers and Baptists and others. The area that they're settling in New England would be current-day Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, that approximate area, focusing on Massachusetts. At the start, John Winthrop is the leader of the Puritans. He's famous for a sermon called A Model of Christian Charity. Sometimes it's just nicknamed the City on a Hill, in which he says that the Christians in Massachusetts, the Puritans, need to set up a godly commonwealth, one of righteousness, one of holiness, one of obedience to God's laws, one of charity towards each other, which would be a model, which would be a light for the old world as they sought to purify the Church of England. The Old Diluter Act refers to, the Old Diluter is Satan who leads us astray. And how do you not get led astray? You learn how to read the Scriptures. You read the Scriptures. Thus, every town of the towns of New England were required by law to hire a teacher to teach children how to read God's holy word. Differences between Jamestown and the Chesapeake settlement. Jamestown along the Chesapeake with the New Englanders. The Jamestown settlement is 1607. That's 13 years before the Separatists, who are these, also called the Pilgrims, arrive in Massachusetts. Big difference here is the Jamestown settlement initially is settled by overwhelmingly lots of single men looking for gold, looking for silver, looking to copy the Spanish, who had plundered the Indians, in particular the Aztecs and Incas, and they don't find gold. And the first several years are really tough. They're not building enough homes. They're not providing for the winter that's coming around the corner. They're not planting crops. And there's going to be a lot of suffering, a lot of mooching off the Indians, a lot of threatening and attacking and stealing from the Indians, a lot of contention between who's in charge. Is it the king's representative? Is it the London Company, which is the joint stock company paying for this venture? Or is it the settlers themselves? And finally, John Smith is going to knock heads and force them to work if they want to eat. Eventually, what will cause the Jamestown settlement to survive is the import from the Caribbean of sweet tobacco from the West Indies, a superior tobacco which took root in Virginia and had a ready market in England. So what you're going to see here in the Chesapeake is a plantation export economy with large farms. After 1619, you're going to see your first black slaves introduced off of a Dutch ship. In New England, you have small farms, and this is going to lead to turning towards the ocean. You get a large, very vibrant transatlantic trade. Think of the triangular trade route between New England, Africa, the Caribbean, and back up to New England. But you have shipping, you have shipbuilding, you have fishing, and this is going to drive the economy of New England. Reasons Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson were threats to Puritan New England. Well, Puritan New England is requiring you to obey these righteous laws. The shorthand is it is a theocracy. And Roger Williams is an advocate of separation of church and state. He does not believe there should be duress. He does not believe there should be coercion in worship. You should be able to worship how you want. People who are not Puritans should be welcome. And he's tossed out, and he's going to go down, and he's going down to what becomes Rhode Island. He's going to settle Providence. And furthermore, Roger Williams was telling the Puritans they had to treat the Indians right. They had to pay the Indians for land that they confiscated. So Williams was a threat because he's challenging the Puritan right to enforce laws. If you don't have these laws obeyed, and if you don't have the covenant which is obeyed, God will not bless the Puritan colony. He will not bless this holy experiment. And Hutchinson, number of strikes against her. She is a female preacher, and that's not supposed to happen. And Hutchinson believed that you did not have to follow laws that made you obey, but she said that the law is written on our hearts. The Holy Spirit brings God's word to us because God lives in us. And there's a nickname for this, being against the law. That's antinomianism, kind of a cool theological word. Antinomianism, and Puritans certainly are not antinomians. They believed that law had to be obeyed. How was Massachusetts a cradle of democracy? Well, think of the Mayflower Compact. The original charter gives them permission to be down in the Virginia area, and they're off course significantly. They agree to obey laws that they will create in this Mayflower Compact. Think of the churches. The churches are democratic at a very personal level on regarding how they worship. The largest group in Puritan New England are the Congregationalists, and that's where the congregation picks their minister and they get rid of their minister, and they decide arguments on their own. A variation of this is Presbyterianism. This is where a cluster of churches in a geographic area elects members that go to what's called a presbytery. Presbytery is a larger group which settles a dispute among churches in a particular area. And then a number of presbyteries send representatives to a general court or general council. And so what you have here is representative democracy. But this is something which is instilling democratic self-government beliefs in the New Englanders from day one. Also keep in mind you have the town meetings. You had separate town meeting buildings perhaps, but probably these town meeting buildings were the local churches, and who to hire for the school, how much to pay them, arguments over land use, things like this would be settled by free white men. Should be noted, it's free white men. Original settlers in New York, these are the Dutch, and the Dutch are in New Amsterdam, which becomes New York, are traders, and they're living relatively peacefully with Indians who they're dependent upon to hunt down these beaver pelts. And the Dutch, being traders, being merchants, they're not into upsetting people over religion, so they allow tolerance. In particular, you have a significant Jewish community of note in New York, maybe not significant in numbers, but significant that Jews are having freedom of worship in this Dutch colony. Wealthy farmers in New York are called patroons, and the English will defeat the Dutch and take this colony for themselves. The effective religion on the colonies, especially Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New York. Massachusetts, some buzzwords here: Pilgrims, Separatists, Puritans, City on a Hill, Theocracy, Religious Intolerance, Old Eleutherac setting up schools, Covenant, Doctrine of Election, this idea that God has chosen the Puritans, that they're special to Him, that they are the visible saints. And this Harvard is set up as the first university in what becomes the United States in the English colonies for the purpose of setting up a seminary and educating future preachers. Rhode Island is the place where you first have separation of church and state, settled by Roger Williams. Pennsylvania is settled by Quakers. William Penn is getting land for a debt to be paid to his father, owed by the king. And the Quakers also believed in religious tolerance. And the Quakers, should be noted, there's some distinctions. Very small group, but they are against slavery. They believe in equal participation of women in worship. They had no clergy, and they were persecuted by the Puritans. And New York, religiously tolerant, has some Jews there. And Maryland is settled by Catholics. And the Toleration Act that is passed there allows religious freedom for all Trinitarians, all who believe in the Holy Trinity, that Jesus is the Son of God. And this is going to do all the Catholics who over time are going to become a minority in their own colony. The effect of geography on various colonies and colonial regions. Keep in mind, big picture here, the South, plantation, long growing season, export crops, primarily tobacco, rice, and indigo. Keep in mind, cotton is not a major export until after 1794 in the Cotton Gin. That's several decades after the end, well, after the start of the Revolutionary War, about a decade after the end of it. So there's cotton being grown in the South, but it's very expensive until they can figure out how to get the seeds out, and that's what Eli Whitney does after the Revolutionary War. In the middle colonies, you have some large farms, you have some plantations, you have some small farms, you have significant trade, especially out of Philadelphia. Lots of food, though, is being grown to feed the slaves in the Caribbean. Something like 90% of the slaves that are being taken out of Africa are in the Caribbean growing sugar. And sugar is very valuable, way more valuable than any food crops. So what you do is you sell some of the sugar and buy animals, you buy meat, you buy grain from the English colonies farther north. And in New England, land not so good. You have lots of small farms, sort of subsistence farms, and turning to the sea, turning to the ocean, transatlantic trade, fishing, trading, shipbuilding. Differences between the southern New England and middle colonies. Again, not to be redundant here, in the South, very hierarchical, with large plantation owners controlling the economy and the politics. Lots of slavery. Big plantations, not a lot of towns, not a lot of schools. New England, you had the least diversity. You had an economy driven by trade, subsistence farms, think of the triangle trade, selling the rum to Africa, the slaves being brought to the Caribbean, and then either sugar or rum being brought to New England, being turned into booze and rum back to Africa. And this is sort of the core part of this triangular route. Don't get too confused. If they had another leg going up to England, maybe bringing shackles to Africa, but this idea of a lively transatlantic trade being dominated by the New England and the middle colonies. You have in the middle colonies the most varied. You have a mixture of religious groups, a mixture of ethnicity. You've got Scots-Irish, you have Dutch, you have Jews, you have Dutch Reformed Calvinists, think of sort of a Dutch Presbyterian. You've got Anglicans, you've got some Puritans have made their way down there. You've got some leftover Swedes from the Delaware colony that get taken over by the Dutch, then taken over by the English. Middle colonies are probably the most like what we become now. At the time of the Revolution, something like 20% of the population of Pennsylvania, for example, was German. And those Pennsylvania Deutsch are not Pennsylvania Dutch. They're Pennsylvania German. Deutsch is German for German. Quakers, again in Pennsylvania, persecuted by the Puritans. They would not take oaths. They had no pastors. They were pacifists. And they believed slavery was wrong, and they believed in the equality of women in worship. Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion, 1676, a date easy to remember because it's 100 years before 1776, American independence. What's going on here is some unhappy farmers on the Virginia frontier are marching on Jamestown, and they're burning the capital of the Virginia government, which is Jamestown. Why? Because they're being ignored. There's Indians attacking the frontier. And Berkeley, Lord Berkeley, who's the governor, Berkeley, is ignoring them. He's dependent on the Indians for his cut of the fur trade, and these poor farmers on the frontier, they lack land, they're being taxed, and they're being ignored, and many of them are former indentures. And the significance of this rebellion is there's going to be a huge spike in the increase of black slaves who aren't going to get their freedom and get to go off and be independent and get unhappy and burn your capital down. So Bacon's Rebellion ultimately is going to be part of this process of more slaves being imported to grow plantation export crops. Some other rebel groups, the Paxton Boys, rebelled against the frontiersmen rebelling in Pennsylvania. You have the Regulators, who were overtaxed poor farmers in the Piedmont mountainous area of North Carolina. And you have Leisler's Rebellion, poor farmers who are rebelling in New York against high taxes and high rents on their land. So increasingly this is making its way into these more recent editions of American history books, that there is a pattern of rebellion in America by white Americans against other white Americans, the poor against the wealthy. Some rebellions that aren't white rebellions that you should know. The Pueblo Rebellion down in the southwest under Pope. This is a Pueblo Indian revolt against the Spanish. They burn all the churches. They kill as many priests as they can get their hands on. They chase out hundreds of Spanish settlers. For something like 50 years, the Indians regain control over their lives and their culture. The Stono Rebellion, this is a pre-Revolutionary War rebellion of black slaves in South Carolina who attempt to escape to Florida. They kill a lot of whites. There's a showdown. Eventually they're captured. Many of them are killed. Many of them are sold back into slavery. King Philip's War, also called Metacom's War. This is a war in New England where whites are pushing on to Indian land, and it's a temporary setback. It's a massive attack on the English colonies, and it's the highest per capita death rate of any American war, if you want to look at it that way. But ultimately the Indians lose because of the superior technology and increasing and relentless numbers of white settlers who are getting off the boats, pushing into Indian land. The triangular trade, again, this is sort of a basic trade route you should know. It's rum from New England to Africa, slaves from Africa to the New World, mostly the Caribbean. Some are going down to Brazil, some are going to the American South, but most of them are in the Caribbean, and they're growing. The sugar is being shipped. Some of it's being shipped. Some of it in the form of liquid molasses up to New England, and this is going to be turned into rum, shipped back to Africa. Now keep in mind, just a small, tiny bit of this sugar is going to New England. Most of the sugar is just going back to Europe for use as sugar. The Middle Passage refers to the slave route from Africa to the Americas, where something perhaps up to a third of the slaves might die. This is a long voyage with a lot of diseases. Mercantilism is a phrase you should know, and this is this idea that the colonies, in particular, we're looking at the English colonies, exist to benefit the mother country. So the American colonies are supposed to ship raw goods to England, and England manufactures these goods and sends them back, sends finished goods back to the colonies, kind of this hermetically sealed system. The thing is, you don't want money leaking out to other countries. You don't want Americans buying to the Dutch, the French, the Portuguese, or the Spanish. Of course, the Americans are doing this, and this is called the period of salutary neglect. Up until the end of the French and Indian War, for a good 100 years or so, the Americans are de facto independent. They're proud to give lip service to being Englishmen. Many people have relatives in England. England's protected the Americans in several wars against France. And Americans are doing well. Typical American farmers eating more calorie, has more meat, has more land than his counterpart in Great Britain. But the Americans are not obeying the Navigation Acts, and they're prospering. They're doing quite well. They're trading, for example, with the Caribbean and with Africa, which they're not supposed to be doing. And they're worshiping how they want, and they're self-governing. Think of the General Court in Massachusetts and the town hall meetings in New England. Think of the House of Burgesses in Virginia. You have this de facto contentment. And salutary neglect, salutary means healthy. Neglect refers to the colonies are being neglected, largely because of these wars against France, because of a civil war that takes place in England, and just the sheer distance. The English can't crack down very effectively, and that will change after the French and Indian War in 1763. Our next unit will be this course of growing hostility between the English. We're going to start limiting our trade and looking for smuggled goods and collecting taxes and increasing taxes and sending soldiers over to enforce these rules. Slavery, the social consequences for America is a second-class population, racial basis for supposed inferiority. The slaves will have zero rights, no rights to their children.